that President Trump's Department of Justice will find some way to indict you?
I believe that they will do everything in their power to do that because they've been ordered to by the president.
Jack Smith, I will not be intimidated. I'm not going to pretend those serious crimes didn't happen.
Tonight is not politics as performance. Tonight is the moment the American justice system gets dragged into the open and forced to say out loud what it is willing to become. You watched the exchange, you heard the names, the threats, the numbers, the repeated insult turned into a weapon, and the consequence hits first. When the President of the United States publicly marks a prosecutor for punishment, it is not a headline, it is a directive, it is a demonstration, it is a warning shot aimed at every federal lawyer, every agent, every witness, every clerk, every judge's chambers. Stand up and you get targeted, stand up and you get hunted, stand up and the state turns its lights on you. Picture the hearing room the way institutions feel it, cameras hot, committee members performing their parts, and Jack Smith sitting there with the plain face of a man who already knows the machine he is staring at. A Vermont Congresswoman, Becca Balint, reads the intimidation into the microphone like it is a charging document. The president saying Smith should be investigated and put in prison, calling him a disgrace to humanity, a radical left Marxist, a criminal, repeating deranged Jack Smith so many times, it stops sounding like a nickname and starts sounding like a ritual. That repetition is not accidental, it is pressure, it is branding, it is the creation of a designated enemy so the system can justify what comes next. Then Smith answers with the sentence the entire patronage mind cannot tolerate. The statements are meant to intimidate me. I will not be intimidated. He says it once, and the room tightens. He says it again, and the threat loses oxygen. He says it again, and you can hear the power shift. No flattery, no appeasement, no hedged language. He does not bargain with the bully. He does not pretend this is normal. He names the tactic. He names the purpose. He refuses the ritual of submission. That refusal is the shock because it cuts straight through the spectacle and lands on the one thing the machine needs to keep hidden: intent. Now, the stakes arrive, immediate and heavy. This is not about Jack Smith's pride. This is about the price tag attached to law enforcement itself. Courtroom pressure, financial pressure, political pressure, braided into one rope. Courtroom pressure means retaliatory prosecutions stop being a dystopian thought experiment and start becoming an agenda item. Financial pressure means a new market in careers emerges overnight. Defend the law and lose your livelihood. Serve the machine and get promoted, protected, paid. Political pressure means the party line replaces the evidentiary record, and the people who insist on the record become the problem that must be removed. Smith escalates without raising his voice. He says, they did their work pursuant to department policy. They followed the facts, they followed the law, and that process produced proof beyond a reasonable doubt that serious crimes were committed. Watch the clash. The machine runs on slogans. Smith speaks in burdens of proof. The machine runs on humiliation. Smith speaks in procedures. The machine runs on fear. Smith speaks in duty. And when he says, I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen because he's threatening me, he is not only defending himself, he is defending the existence of a reality outside propaganda. Balint presses the final spike into the record. Do you believe the President's Department of Justice will find some way to indict you? Smith answers, like a man reading a memo aloud, they will do everything in their power to do that because they have been ordered to by the President. That is the hearing's real headline. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the stakes stated plainly, sitting under oath in public in a country that still pretends this cannot happen. No one watching this needs an Institutions 101 lecture. You already know the terminology. You already know what a Department of Justice is supposed to be, and you already know what it becomes when it's treated as the President's personal firm. The trust reset is not about persuading naive viewers. It is about locating the line that has already been crossed. When a former special counsel testifies that he expects indictment because the president ordered it, the line is behind us. The question is not whether intimidation exists. The question is whether the state is allowed to convert intimidation into policy. This is why the reaction clips matter, even when they feel like commentary and not evidence. When Nicole Wallace says she watched with a lump in her throat, she is not performing sentiment. She is describing institutional memory. Before the Purge culture, there were hundreds of Jack Smiths inside the department, career prosecutors, career agents, people who chose public service over private fortune, people who understood the professional ethic that says, if you are ordered to do something wrong, you resign. That ethic once acted like an immune response. But when resignation becomes mass departure, the institution does not heal. It hollows, it empties, it leaves behind titles without the competence that made those titles credible. Now to the law, because the law is where the machine either breaks or wins. The intimidation campaign is not just ugly speech. It is a governance strategy. It is the conversion of prosecutorial discretion into political revenge. In a functioning system, the prosecutor's job is to evaluate evidence, apply statute, meet burdens, and act under policy constraints. In a captured system, the prosecutor's job is to serve the boss, punish enemies, and protect allies. The difference between those two systems is not aesthetics. It is whether citizens live under rules or under rulers. It is whether the courts exist as an external check or as a ceremonial backdrop. Smith's phrasing is precise for a reason. We follow department policy. That is a shield and a trap. It is a shield because DOJ policy, especially around sitting presidents, exists to prevent constitutional crisis from becoming a political weapon. It is a trap because the moment a president treats DOJ as an extension of his will, that same policy becomes a choke point used against the people who tried to enforce the law when the president was a private citizen. That is the inversion, that is the flip. The policy meant to stabilize the system becomes the excuse to punish the people who tried to hold the line. And notice what Smith refuses to do. He refuses to litigate the case as a TV fight. He refuses the sparring that would make him look political. He stays in the lane of evidence and standards because that lane is exactly what they need to erase. The machine cannot defeat the record in court if the record is intact. So it attacks the record keeper, it attacks the witnesses, it attacks the agents, it attacks the prosecutors, it attacks the very concept that there's a fact pattern that does not care about loyalty. This is where the financial pressure locks in. A government that runs on intimidation also runs on incentives. If you can make a prosecutor fear prison for doing his job, you can make every other prosecutor price that fear into every decision. You can make them delay subpoenas. You can make them soften language. You can make them decline charges. You can make them move on. And in Washington, moving on is not neutrality. Moving on is surrender. So when Smith says calmly that he will not be intimidated, he is not delivering a personal mantra. He is describing the last remaining ingredient of prosecutorial independence, a human being who will not trade reality for safety. That is why the hearing feels extraordinary. The extraordinary part is not the insults. The extraordinary part is that someone answered them like a professional on the record, knowing the professional price. Let's pin down the legal mechanics without pretending any of this is abstract. The intimidation is not merely rhetoric. In law, intimidation is conduct with predictable effects. It chills testimony, it chills cooperation, it chills enforcement. That is the point. When Smith says the statements are meant to intimidate him, he is also describing an intent directed outward, as a warning to others what will happen if they stand up. That is witness management by threat. That is institutional control by fear. That is the transformation of public service into a high-risk occupation where the penalty for competence is personal ruin. Then there is the retaliation problem, the one Balint forced into daylight. A president ordering his Justice Department to indict a former prosecutor for past work is not normal political conflict. It is the weaponization of criminal process. The mechanics are simple. You take a target, you take pliable leadership, you shop for a theory, you open an investigation, you leak, you smear, you drag the person through process punishment, and you teach everyone else the lesson. The system is not a neutral referee. The system is a club. Process punishment is the hidden engine here. Even an acquittal does not restore time, money, health, reputation. Even a dismissed charge does not undo months of legal bills, threats, headlines, security costs. The point is not conviction. The point is obedience. And a captured DOJ does not need perfect facts to create perfect fear. It needs sufficient machinery to grind. Now consider Smith's anchor phrase, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard matters because it is the standard you must meet before you take someone's liberty. It is not a vibe. It is not a partisan belief. It is the barrier between accusation and state power. When Smith says he had proof beyond a reasonable doubt of serious crimes, he is implicitly daring the public to remember what the standard sounds like. He is putting professional weight behind the record, and that is why the machine must attack him even after the case is halted. The case can be delayed, the transcript can be mocked, but the existence of a prosecutor willing to say, beyond a reasonable doubt in public, is a threat to a system that survives on fog. This is where courts enter as both shield and battleground. The judiciary is not a magic wand. Courts operate on filings, standing, jurisdiction, timetables, remedies. A determined executive can weaponize delay, venue, and procedural noise. It can bury accountability in motions, appeals, and administrative churn. It can make justice arrive too late to matter. That is why the hearing is about more than one prosecution. It is about whether the legal system can still produce consequences on a timescale that matters to democracy, not just to historians. And you saw in the reactions the institutional tragedy. Commentators describe the DOJ professional ethic. If you are asked to do something wrong, you resign. That ethic is noble, but it creates a vacuum when the wrongdoing is systematic. Resignation preserves personal integrity, but it also drains the institution of skilled resistance. Forests of resignations leave behind open desks for loyalists. Then the loyalists inherit the titles, the letterhead, the subpoena power. That is how capture consolidates. That is how the Overton window shifts from unthinkable to routine. So when Smith predicts indictment, he is not forecasting a single case. He is naming the culmination of a chain: intimidate, purge, replace, retaliate, normalize. That chain is not new in human history. The novelty is watching it hit a system that has long marketed itself as immune. The novelty is hearing in a congressional room the most senior kind of career prosecutor say, the president is ordering retribution and the department will try to deliver it. Escalation follows. Not because someone might do something. Escalation follows because incentives demand it. A machine that wins by intimidation must keep intimidating. A machine that wins by punishing dissent must keep punishing dissent. It cannot stop without admitting it was wrong. It cannot stop without losing power, so it presses forward. Now watch the image collapse, because that is where the regime reveals itself. The official image is law and order. The reality is selective law, selective order. The image is we are rooting out corruption. The reality is we are criminalizing opposition. The image is the department is restored. The reality is the department is hollowed out and refilled with obedience. And Jack Smith, sitting there, sober and ascetic, becomes the mirror that makes the spectacle look obscene. A sober man in a drunk bar, a serious public servant in a carnival of menace. That contrast is why they need him humiliated, not debated. You can feel the panic and the need to discredit him even after the cases are closed. That tells you everything. If the record were meaningless, they would not need to muddy him. If the evidence were weak, they would not need to intimidate the man who gathered it. They need to destroy credibility because credibility survives even when a case is halted by policy. Credibility survives in transcripts. Credibility survives in documents. Credibility survives in the simple fact that a professional can say under oath that he followed the facts and the law and got to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That statement is not entertainment. That statement is corrosive to propaganda. This is where the courts, the judges, the rejections start to matter as an escalation engine. The machine will shop for rulings that bless its narrative and punish its enemies. It will treat adverse rulings as personal insults. It will pressure institutions to rewrite standards. It will use Congress as a theater to launder talking points into official record, and it will count on the public's fatigue. Fatigue is the lubricant of capture. Fatigue is how extraordinary becomes normal. Now the options break down because this is where people lie to themselves. The options are all bad, and that is the point. Option 1, indict Smith. That is the authoritarian option. It tells every prosecutor and agent that the boss can criminalize their past work. It destroys independence. It turns DOJ into a personal security force. It invites future retaliation cycles that never end. It also forces the courts to either stop it and become the enemy or allow it and become complicit. Either way, the institution gets scarred. Option 2, don't indict Smith. That is the soft power option, and it is not clean because the threat still stands as a lesson. The warning still worked on others. The climate still changes. The fear still operates. You do not need to prosecute the first time if the intimidation has already achieved compliance across the bureaucracy. You simply let the threat hang like a sword that never needs to drop because everyone sees it. Option 3, investigate around Smith. Target staff, target agents, target witnesses. That is often how this game is played. You do not need the headline, Jack Smith indicted, if you can create a cascade of subpoenas, ethics complaints, security clearances pulled, jobs lost, reputation shredded. You make the cost of public service so high that only zealots remain. Option 4, legislative revenge, hearings, referrals, contempt threats, defunding. That is the congressional wing of intimidation. It dresses punishment in parliamentary procedure. It weaponizes oversight to punish oversight. It is a legal costume for a political hit. Every option leaves damage, and the damage is the strategy. The humiliation stage is built into it. The target must be seen as weak, dirty, discredited. Because humiliation is how the machine teaches the audience to accept punishment as entertainment. Humiliation is the emotional bridge between propaganda and prosecution. And that is why the hearing is not a footnote. It is a demonstration. It is the state showing you on camera how it wants obedience to look. Here is the rule of law frame stated plainly. A democracy cannot survive if the executive can punish prosecutors for prosecuting. That is not a partisan claim. That is the skeletal structure of constitutional governance. The moment the state can retroactively criminalize enforcement against the powerful, the law stops being law and becomes a menu, applied to enemies, waived for friends. That is not politics. That is organized impunity. The moral core is accountability. The bully does not merely want to win elections. The bully wants to own the prosecutor. The bully wants to turn prosecution into punishment for disobedience. A prosecutor does not exist to win applause. A prosecutor exists to put evidence into a legal process that can deprive a person of liberty only if the state meets its burden. When Smith says he had proof beyond a reasonable doubt, he is asserting that the burden was met. When he says he will not pretend it did not happen because he is threatened, he is asserting that intimidation cannot rewrite the record. That stance is not hero worship. It is the minimum standard for a free state. Now look at the political fallout. Because politics is where institutions are either defended or sold, the hearing revealed two Americas inside one room. One America still speaks in facts, burdens, and process. The other America speaks in loyalty, insult, spectacle. One America treats resignation as ethical refusal. The other America treats resignation as cleansing, as an opportunity to replace expertise with obedience. And the enabling apparatus is not just a single politician. It is the network of members who treat lying as a skill, who treat hearings as content, who treat evidence as optional, who treat consequence as something that only applies to the other side. Institutional fallout is already visible in the culture of departures. When whole forests resign, the institution does not simply lose staff, it loses memory, it loses craftsmanship, it loses the quiet competence that keeps prosecutions clean and mistakes rare. It loses the people who know where boundaries are buried and why those boundaries mattered. Then the next generation arrives into an environment where the boundaries are gone and they learn the new lesson. The safest route is obedience. That is how a bureaucracy becomes a machine. That is how a machine becomes a regime. Financial fallout follows because markets price stability. They price institutional credibility. A justice system perceived as transactional becomes a risk premium on everything. Investment decisions, corporate planning, international trust. A captured DOJ is not merely a domestic scandal. It is a structural threat to the country's capacity to enforce contracts, deter fraud, and project seriousness abroad. The cost is not poetic. The cost is measurable. The cost is constant. And now the inevitable ending, because the arc is not mysterious. A machine built on intimidation must keep escalating until it collides with a hard limit. Either the courts hold or they yield. Either the bureaucracy retains enough independent spine or it becomes a patronage conveyor belt. Either the public demands accountability or it is trained into apathy while the machinery tightens around dissent. Jack Smith's testimony is a marker on that timeline, not because he is a savior, because he did the one thing intimidation cannot survive. He named it, he refused it, and he put the record back on the table. The machine will try to punish that. It will try to smear that. It will try to bury that. But the record persists, and pressure compounds. This ends with accountability returning in one form or another, because systems cannot run forever on fear without breaking something essential. They break trust, they break competence, they break legitimacy, and when legitimacy breaks, consequences do not drift in slowly. They arrive all at once like a verdict read into a silent room.